All right. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kim Adamski, HIV prevention specialist at the Hartford Gay and Lesbian Health Collective. Some of you probably tuned in last week to our live session about consent with our guest from the YWCA in New Britain. This week, we rescheduled our live session from 2 weeks ago that we were going to do on Facebook Live and didn't work out because of technical issues, excuse me. I'm sure that some of you have experienced that delightful situation. So anyway, Hartford Gay and Lesbian Health Collective, if you don't know, I expect you do if you're watching this, but we're in Hartford. We are at 1841 Broad Street in the South End, and we do things like dental, STD testing, support groups, that sort of thing. We are currently open, and we've been open for a while. But we do have some safety precautions in place, of course, to keep you all safe and healthy. So today our guest is Nisha Gandhi from EquityCT, and she is here to talk with us a little about discrimination. Can you tell us, Nisha, about your position and your organization?
Sure. So EquityCT started off as a day-long symposium that was housed within the School and State Finance Project. So this took place last October, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But essentially we had a bunch of different guest speakers, we had workshops, and it was all kind of centered around this idea of equity and how we can integrate equity into our everyday lives and our everyday conversations. And the feedback that we got from that event was that people wanted more. They wanted more time to talk. They wanted more events. They wished it wasn't only a day long. So our solution to that was to kind of branch it off as its own organization. So that's what we have EquityCT functioning as right now. And I started off doing communications and policy with the School and State Finance Project. But as we expanded EquityCT, I also started doing communications for EquityCT. So I work on a lot of the website stuff. I send out all the emails, the newsletter. I handle all the technical side of things too, whenever we're hosting workshops or webinars. So that's kind of my role within the EquityCT team.
Awesome. That's a cool origin story. People just demanded more from the training, and it turned into an organization.
Yeah, we weren't expecting it, but we're really happy it happened. So
yeah, that's great. So what are some examples of how EquityCT works to address inequities in Connecticut?
So our theory is to listen to communities first, right? Because oftentimes I think a lot of organizations come in and they're like, we know that there's this equity problem and we know how to fix it and we're going to tell you how you're going to fix it. But I think that that's not really sustainable in a community, right? You need to listen to what's already going on, what people are already doing, maybe how you can uplift some of their actions, some of their ideas with your own organizational resources rather than trying to step in when you don't really know your way around that community. So that's our first thing. We like to listen. And then after that, we like to educate, empower, and inspire. So our ultimate goal is to equip people with the tools that they need to continue moving forward with equity work. And so we want to set ourselves up so we can take a step back when we need to, and the process won't fall apart. We want people to be able to be as autonomous as possible by the end of it.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like, standard sort of public health best practice. And honestly, I'm a public health person, so I'm let's follow this in everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wholly approve. All right, so in Connecticut, we see some discrimination towards LGBTQ folks. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think Connecticut is unique in that regard?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people have this misconception of Connecticut, right? Because we're typically a very blue state, right? People perceive Connecticut as this very progressive, very liberal place where people are super accepting and, discrimination doesn't happen and we don't have to deal with things like that. And then I think people on the ground in Connecticut know that that's not true and that it's very easy to see instances of discrimination around Connecticut. So, it can show up in so many different variations, right? It could be housing discrimination where certain neighborhoods don't let certain people with certain last names live there, right? It could be in hiring discrimination where you don't see a lot of organizations that look like the people in the communities that they're trying to serve, right? So you can see like little instances of discrimination all over the place. Like maybe we don't have as much explicit, like, okay, we have a bunch of very ignorant people like saying very ignorant things like explicitly in public, but we have so much of this implicit discrimination going on that I think honestly has even worse and a more long-term impact than some of those more explicit forms of discrimination does.
And I feel like in some ways that's a lot harder to address because mostly these people are like, I'm not racist. I'd never be racist. Because they they don't realize they're doing it necessarily.
Right. Exactly.
A lot of people in Connecticut aren't like, yeah, I hate this group.
Right.
They just don't know.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to address. So when, like you said, when you have a liberal state, the laws are often on the side of minority groups. I mean, we have pretty good laws to protect, for example, the LGBT community overall. But I mean, that doesn't mean that individual people treat that group fairly. Like there's no law against saying something mean to a gay person. It's wrong, but you know, individual people can still be very problematic. And I mean, like Nisha said, the structural discrimination affects the LGBT community as well. One reason we have the Health Collective, is because a lot of LGBT folks do not feel comfortable in traditional healthcare environments because of how they've been treated, or even just because, I mean, doctors aren't trained as well as they could be in gender issues, so they might not know. So that's kind of the lowdown on the LGBTQ counterpart of that. So discrimination obviously is harmful to all our communities, and since our organization specializes in the LGBTQ community, the discrimination we see kind of creates an us versus them mentality. So can you tell us what that kind of means, Nisha?
Yeah, so I think it's really easy to create like an us versus them mentality when discrimination is happening consistently towards the same group of people, right? So in this case, if we're talking about the LGBTQ community, like we see it all the time that like there are certain repeated instances of discrimination towards that community. So all of a sudden, right, like if you identify as LGBTQ and you see somebody else who also identifies as LGBTQ, there's kind of like this click that happens, right? Where you're like, oh, you probably have experienced some of the same discrimination that I've experienced. You've probably experienced some of the same really great things that I've experienced too, right? So like you're creating that us, and then there's that other them with the people who don't identify as LGBTQ, right? And so I think the way that discrimination plays a role in that is like, the more of those events that keep happening to the same groups of people, I think the heightened that us versus them becomes, right? Like all of a sudden, you know, like these people are living the same life experiences I'm living because I know what like our surroundings are like. I know what people in our surroundings are like. So I think that like that coupled with microaggressions and like a direct attack, or like if legislation changes that is no longer in favor of the LGBTQ community, right? Like this all works to kind of create this like us versus them mentality.
Can you tell us what microaggressions means, by the way?
Yeah, so microaggressions are things that maybe are not as explicitly looked at as discrimination, but they still feel like discrimination, right? So it could be something as simple as a misdirected question, or it could be something like assuming somebody's gender identity just based on how they look, right? Like little things like that people don't necessarily realize that they're doing, or they don't necessarily realize are wrong, but they still like inflict harm on that community.
And how can we address ourselves when we do microaggressions? Because I mean, everybody does. That's kind of the human condition. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I think so. Conversation is super important. And I think being in spaces and like intentionally being in spaces, I should say, where that kind of conversation is easy to have is, I think, the most helpful way to kind of check yourself when you are doing something that can be viewed as a microaggression, right? And I think so much of that is also surrounding yourself with as diverse of a group of people as you can, right? So like if you have a lot of friends who have a lot of different identities, you'll kind of catch yourself with those microaggressions a little bit quicker than if you have a bunch of friends who look, think, behave exactly like you. It's a little bit trickier to catch yourself then.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, on the flip side of us versus them, there's also always discrimination within certain minority groups. In particular, I mean, like I said, I'm more involved with the LGBTQ community. And in that community, there is discrimination against in groups. So for example, discrimination against bisexual folks by gay and lesbian folks is a thing that happens and is referred to usually as bisexual erasure. Can you tell me a little about why that happens? Discrimination within the in-group?
Yeah, so I like to call it this thing called oppression Olympics, right? Within this in where you're kind of competing to see who is the most oppressed, like who is actually getting the brunt of this discrimination, who's struggling the most out of all of these people in your in-group, right? So I think it's very easy to fall into that trap because it's very easy to want to create this story about yourself or about somebody that you know where they are really, really struggling and still pushing through. And I think that you really have to ground yourself in that, like, you're all in the same in-group and you're all fighting for the same thing, right? So that kind of oppression Olympics is not productive, right? Like you won't get to the end point where you're at this point of equity if you are fighting amongst yourselves over who has it the worst, or like situating it so that there's like different tiers of oppression within your already oppressed group, right? Like I think the more complicated you make that, the harder it is to get to that point of equity.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody has their own individual set of circumstances and identities that may be discriminated against, which I think leads us to intersectionality. What's intersectionality, Nisha?
So I'm going to read you the definition that we use for EquityCT because I think that it's really great. So it's the theoretical framework of understanding how an individual's different social and political identities work together to create a unique system of oppression, discrimination, and privilege. So essentially, it's the way that an individual's different identities kind of are existing together, and they create kind of a very unique form of oppression for that individual or of privilege for that individual, right? So, for example, like I am a woman of color from South Asia, right? Like with South Asian origins, but I hold a master's degree. So I have this form of privilege there that I earn, that's an earned privilege, but I have this form of oppression as well as like being a woman of color in America, right? So that's like a unique situational like identity for me that I have to navigate like all these different kinds of oppression and privilege and whatever with, right? So it's impossible for me to approach it without one of those identities, right? Like I can't just be a woman. I can't just be of color. I can't just hold this master's degree, right? Like they all exist together. So I think paying attention to how those identities exist together is really important when you're talking about equity and discrimination.
Yeah, everyone's their own unique little mix of things, right?
Yeah.
That includes oppression and privilege. So I mean, like you said, it's really important to consider intersectionality when we approach equity, and if we don't, then we're totally missing the point on how to approach different issues. How are we going to properly approach, for example, helping LGBTQ folks access healthcare when we're not even considering the fact that we're in a Black and brown neighborhood? And I'm not saying we do that. We do our best. I think we do an okay job. But of course, there's always room for improvement for everybody.
Right.
Okay, so I think an issue is, and I mean, I think we've all experienced this, it can be kind of hard stepping in when something troubling happens in front of you that you think is discrimination or prejudice. What's your advice on how to approach a situation like that?
Yeah, so I think that there's so many levels when you're approaching that, right? Like, I think it's really easy to just say that it's that stereotypical bystander effect where you think that somebody will say something, so you're not going to say something. But I think it goes deeper than that, especially when it's something that's happening to a group that you yourself identify with, right? Like, these are traumatic events for many people, and people respond to trauma in so many different ways. And it's very likely that someone is just shutting down. Like, it's not that they're not saying anything because they don't want to or know how to, but like they physically don't feel like they can. Or they may not feel safe because of, you know, maybe their race is coupled into this identity, maybe their immigration status is, and they don't want to risk something like that, right? So I think that it goes so much deeper than just saying like someone needs to do something and like I don't know why no one is. So I think it's really important to learn and be aware of what those triggers are for you if you are someone who finds yourself in these situations, right? So like if you know that you can't handle it when someone is saying something extremely derogatory in front of you to somebody, like knowing that I think really helps alleviate the pressure that I think we put on ourselves to step in and say something, because you are aware that that's just something that you can't do. There are so many organizations that offer great bystander training. So I know Hollaback in particular. I'm sure you can share the link, but it's like a completely virtual training, and it like walks you through exactly what you can do. There's like a 5-step process. It's like distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. And so it like shows you what to do if you are in a position where you maybe don't want to physically step in, right? Like doing something like, oh, hey, I think you dropped something, if someone is saying something rude, right?
Yeah.
Or being like, oh, hey, like I finally found you, like I'm so sorry I'm running late, and like pulling somebody away, right? Like there's so many smaller things you can do that's not like, hey, stop saying that to that person, that's really rude, right? Because sometimes that's not a safe thing to do in that situation. So I think equipping yourself with like a bunch of different very practical tools on what to do when something's happening is super helpful. It's super important, and much better than you just expecting yourself to jump in and be like the saving grace in that situation.
I was muted, oops. I think that something that's really hard is even being able to think on your feet like that. Because I mean, I know even when stuff happens to me that makes me uncomfortable in some way, like, I mean, I'm a bicyclist to work, and you know, biking makes you a prime target for street harassment, but I don't know what to say when it happens. So I imagine it can be even harder when it's somebody else, because first you're like, am I safe? Then you're like, is that person in imminent danger? Then you're like, you know, how should I step in? Like, there's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And I mean, things like social anxiety can come into play. If you can't even talk to somebody friendly at a party, how are you going to approach somebody harassing somebody?
Exactly, yeah.
So it's tough. But I actually have heard the 5 Ds before. I read a book a while back called Creating Safer Spaces. I don't know if you've read that.
I think I've heard of it. I haven't fully read it yet.
Yeah, I like found it on a friend's shelf and was like, can I borrow this?
Nice.
But yeah, no, it was really useful, and it had very detailed examples and directions on using the 5 Ds. And theirs was specifically for venues. And I mean, we know the music scene can be a little bit iffy for women and minority groups. So it talked about how like hosts and stuff could do it, but I mean, it's applicable to anybody. So yeah. I would recommend reading it and also going to Hollaback for sure, to their website. Okay, so if you feel like you've been discriminated against, what are some things that you can do about it?
So I think the number one thing is that if you are comfortable talking with somebody, you should definitely talk to somebody. And that can be in the form of a therapist, that can be talking to your friend, that can be talking to maybe your boss if it's happening at work and you feel comfortable going to them, or like any mentor that you have in your life. I think like walking through what has happened kind of brings you this sense of clarity, and you can kind of figure out like, okay, what are some concrete steps I can take, right? Because there are ways to report things, but like you have to be aware that reporting things also means that it might take a very long time. There's no guarantee in that outcome. There's no like, you know, if you don't have it fully documented or something, right? Like you don't know what that situation and what that process is going to look like for you specifically. So the most important thing there is to like heal yourself at some point, right? Like that is a traumatic experience for a lot of people, and like you may not realize it right away, but like at some point it may manifest into something bigger. So I think making sure that you are talking to somebody about it, making sure that if it's possible to document something, like for example, if something's happening online, like making sure you do document everything that you can so it helps you in case you decide to report. And I think like it's really helpful to have some sort of affinity group is what I like to say, where you can talk to others who maybe share some of your identities and maybe have experienced something similar, because I think it's really easy to feel very alone and be like, why did that happen to me? Like, what was I doing wrong? Like, what did I do to bring that on? And I think the more you talk to others who maybe look like you or think like you or like have the same sexuality or any kind of life experience as you, like you start to figure out that it's not something that is exclusive to you, and that somebody else that you know has probably dealt with it and maybe they have great strategies for how to cope with it and things like that. So I think being as open as you can be about it is really, really helpful there.
Yeah, I think that personalizing it is definitely a really easy thing to do. Because I mean, when somebody said something prejudiced, they don't really mean it at you specifically. I mean, it's still a messed up thing to do.
Right.
But it's very easy to be like, why did I do something wrong? And I mean, it's similar in cases of like assault and stuff. People don't feel control of the situation. So they end up being like, what could I have changed? But I agree that healing is really important, because I mean, going through the authorities is really stressful and not always worth it for the person.
Yeah, exactly.
But of course, for some people it is, and people should make their own choices about that for sure. So like you said, your safety is the priority. What do you mean in that regard? Like if you've been discriminated against, how do you keep yourself safe?
Yeah, so I mean, there's levels to that, right? Like in the moment that it's happening, I think your safety is the most important, right? So some people are much more antagonizing than others, and so if you feel like you standing up for yourself is going to put your life in danger, don't do it. It's not worth it. At some point that person will move on and walk away, and if they don't, like, you know, you can find a way to get out of that situation. But I think especially if you are someone who is trained in all of these things and knows all of these things, like when that's happening to you, you feel this sense of, wait, I know how to do this. Like I've been preparing for this all this time. Like I know exactly what to do. But if doing so is going to put your life in danger, like that is not what you should do.
Mm-hmm.
And then similarly, right, like down the line, if reporting something is going to put your life in danger, because oftentimes, like if you are accusing someone of something, they'll know that you accuse them if you go through the authorities, right? Like they'll know, because maybe they'll put a restraining order on that person. Maybe like you'll have to see them in some capacity when you are sharing something with somebody, right? So if you think that like doing that is going to put your physical life in danger, like it's really important to assess if that is worth it to you, and make sure that, you know, you recognize that that is what's happening. Because I think a lot of times it's so easy to get caught up in the moment and then like realizing what you did way after the fact and not being able to go back in time and change that, right? So I think like prioritizing your safety and both like physical life and also like your mental health, right? Like if you know that something is going to be extremely triggering for you and like activate some part of, like, if you have really bad anxiety, if you have bad social anxiety, if you're struggling with depression, anything like that, like if you think that what you're doing is going to heighten those feelings, like it may not be worth it for you to do that, right, when you're facing discrimination. So a lot of this is so much self-awareness that I think people don't think about all the time, right? But when you are trying to be like the most prepared you possibly can be for if something happens to you, I think those are the important factors to think about.
Yeah, that's great. And I think another thing that people tend to gloss over is the concern about economic security. So if you're being discriminated against at work, it's so easy to say, well, why don't you just quit? Why don't you just report them to HR? Why don't you just take them to court? Like, you need the money to pay your rent. You don't want to like,
you need money for legal fees. You need money for everything.
So that's really important to a lot of people. And I mean, if that is something you're able to do and you want to do, that's awesome. But it's another thing that's not always worth it.
Yeah.
And it's really awful that that's something that can happen. And like, I don't know, I'm just mad.
Yeah, that you even have to consider things like this, right? Like you have to think about like, is my life going to be in danger if I go and tell somebody what happened to me? But like, that's the reality of what we're living through, right? So I think
Yeah.
being as aware as you can be is super important there.
Yeah, you got to protect yourself. It's not victim blaming to advise people to protect themselves first before they take action.
Yeah.
So, all right, so we're just about hitting time. If anybody currently watching has questions, you can ask or type in the message box. We're also recording this, so anyone who's got questions after the fact, you can DM us. You can comment on this. My email address is kim@hglhc.org. And our phone number at Health Collective is 860-278-4163. So you can call with questions, or if you want to schedule an appointment, anything like that. And Nisha, can you provide some contact for EquityCT?
Sure. So the best way to reach us is just through my email. So if you just email nisha.gandhi@equityct.org, that's the best way to get in contact with me.
Okay, awesome. So again, anyone's got any questions, let us know, contact us in some way. I really appreciate you coming on today, Nisha, especially since we had to reschedule. It was a whole thing, but this worked out really well.
Yeah.
And I hope that viewers right now and on the recorded version learn something, review something that they already knew. Check out EquityCT's website. What is that? EquityCT.org?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, check that out. Learn more about them. And thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.